Jennifer with HKM Engineering. Just to kind of give everybody an idea of what's going on, as you're all well aware, MDT, the city, and the county have all been getting quite a bit of pressure due to congestion on Reserve Street to look at some sort of alternate route or some sort of work out in that area to relieve the congestion. And one of the big issues has been a west side bypass. Many of you know that quite some time ago in one of our transportation plans, we reviewed the possibility of a bypass following the Blue Mountain corridor, and basically it was not shown to divert enough traffic, so that was never moved forward. There's been quite a bit of discussion about possibly going another route on the west side of Reserve Street and doing a bypass. One of the things that I noticed in that area was there's a substantial amount of parks and recreational properties. So prior to initiating a feasibility study that would cost in the neighborhood of $300,000 or more to do it, I got to talking to my environmental engineer as well as Daryl and a few others, and we got to looking at it. And one of the big concerns I saw out there was what they referred to as 4F property. It's parks and recreational. And Daryl's going to give you quite a bit of information and explain what exactly that is. But basically it's a section in NEPA that deserves special protection, and it's very restrictive within the NEPA process. So prior to initiating a full-fledged feasibility study, what I pitched to the Metropolitan Planning Organization, the MPO here in Missoula, was possibly hiring Daryl or another NEPA expert to come in and present to us what were the challenges going to be if we did look at a west side bypass. And I want to make it very clear, there is no project out there, there's nothing nominated, programmed, we are not moving forward with the project. What this simply is it's a quick, very preliminary feasibility review of should we propose in the future a west side bypass, what are some of the challenges we're going to deal with? And in particular, what is the challenge going to be relative to 4F within NEPA? What we're basically looking at is having Daryl give a presentation and an explanation of 4F to the policy and decision makers with the city, the county, and MDT to kind of give us an idea of what challenges we're going to be dealing with. When I turn it over to Daryl, basically what he's going to do is give you a presentation, explain what 4F is, what properties exist out there. He's going to show you a map of the properties we've identified that are already existing and protected. Then we're basically going to open it up for question and answer. Now, when we go to that question and answer, the main purpose of this meeting is to present this information to the policy and decision makers within, again, the city and the county and MDT. So I would ask that the public hold their questions until we've addressed most of the questions from the decision makers. Once we're done with that, if time is remaining, without a doubt, we'll open it up for the public. Unless there's something I'm missing, I'm going to turn it over to Daryl.
There we go. All right. The first thing I think I want to show you is just a general overview of what a typical project development process looks like. You would generally start a project like this, or unlike this, because it's not really a project yet. It's still just a concept somewhere out to the left of your long-range planning process. I know that this concept has been floated around in the community for probably 20 years or better. On whether you need something to the west or a new interchange connection on the west side. But at this point, it's really still just a general concept in your long-range transportation plan. Right now, you have a request for proposals on the street for the Missoula Transportation Plan Update. So that would be the first real solid opportunity to forward this or not forward the concept of a west side bypass. Out of that transportation plan, you identify a number of different roadway improvement projects, safety projects, transit projects, trails, bike systems. All those are individual projects that are identified in the transportation plan update. Those are individually forwarded through the environmental process, or the National Environmental Policy Act. I'll probably say NEPA a number of times just because I'll slip into that. NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act. That is the string of yellow boxes there. For a project like this, for a new roadway on a new alignment, you would generally think about doing an environmental impact statement. From the notice of intent through a record of decision, you're probably talking about a 2 to 3 year process. Pretty extensive. You're going to look at a number of different issue areas that range from wetlands and floodplains to cultural resources, historic resources, parklands, noise impacts. There's about 15 or 18 different categories of impacts that you'll have to analyze in detail, one of which is Section 4F, and that's what we're going to spend most of our time talking about today. Once you get through, if it's appropriate, a record of decision from the Federal Highway Administration, you'd go into the project design phase. Preliminary design, final design, right-of-way acquisition. Again, that's probably another 2 to 3 year process before you get into project construction. So from the initial concept of a new roadway through to project construction, this is probably a 7 to 10 year process. Just through the environmental, you're talking several $100,000. Through project design, probably in the millions of dollars. And then for this, depending on what type of a project you ultimately decided, again, you're talking somewhere around the 10-year time frame, and in the millions of dollars just for project development, not including construction. So that's just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the concept that we're here to talk about. And unless there's any questions specifically on the process, I'd like to spend more time just talking about what kind of constraints you have. This is a little bit tough to see up there, so I'm going to pass out. Jennifer's going to pass out some handouts. We've got several. When Dwayne first asked me if we would come and lead a discussion, I was expecting a group more like this than this. So I apologize. We may not have enough handouts for everybody, but hopefully people can share and kind of look over shoulders. Section 4F is an antiquated term for a piece of. It was literally Section 4. Subpart F of the 1966 Transportation Act. It's been subsequently recodified and it no longer resides under that section, but that terminology has stuck. What Section 4F refers to is the Secretary of Transportation was given the responsibility to give utmost protection to public parks, recreational areas, wildlife refuges, historic and cultural resources, wild and scenic rivers. There's a list of special resources that the U.S. Department of Transportation had to look at and give special protection. The only way that they could actually impact those type of areas is if there was A, no prudent and feasible alternative to using that particular land, and that the project included all possible planning to minimize harm to the park, recreation area, wildlife or waterfowl refuge, or historic site resulting from the use. So those are two critical pieces. One, avoid it at all cost. Two, if you have to hit it, you have to minimize those impacts to the greatest extent feasible. This is probably one of the most concrete hurdles under the National Environmental Policy Act. You can mitigate for wetland impacts, you can mitigate for noise, but 4F is don't touch it. If you do, you got to have a very, very solid reason for it. If you have to hit it, you have to minimize those impacts to the greatest extent possible. I'm going to ask Jennifer to pass out another sheet here. It's just an information sheet from the Federal Highway Administration that outlines generally what I've just told you, and I can give you much more specific detail if you'd like to talk more about that. What you'll see on that sheet, and in general on this slide, are a number of resources within the area that we've looked at just on the west side, basically between downtown and the airport. You've got a number of different state lands, conservation easements, Fort Missoula, the JTL gravel pit, Missoula County, Big Sky Park, and the Tower Street Conservation Area. You can see these are all protected resources, and there's really not an open corridor initially to just identify an alignment that doesn't hit some type of protected resource on the west side of Missoula. So as we kind of looked at this in very general terms and talked with the Department of Transportation about the general feasibility of a west side bypass. This is one thing that jumps out and says, okay, if you were to take this further, if you start to go into project development, what do you need to do first? Well, the first thing under the National Environmental Policy Act is to identify what they call the purpose and need. What's the purpose of your proposed roadway, and what's the need for it? In previous transportation planning efforts, modeling efforts conducted by the Department of Transportation with your MPO, your Metropolitan Planning Organization, they have modeled a west side bypass, and there's not a substantiated quote-unquote need today for a west side bypass. It doesn't provide traffic relief for any of your other north-south arterials. Now that's under today's conditions with a projection out 20 years. So the way Missoula is growing, that could change rapidly. So again, if it's something that the community decides is of importance and interest, then it's something that you'd have to do, is model that and figure out what need what purpose it serves and what need it satisfies. So that's your first hurdle. What's the purpose of the project? What need is it intended to satisfy or address? Second, you'd have to look at a number of different alternatives under the NEPA process. Is there an alternative to a west side bypass that would cut through these 4F resources? Does it mean going even further west and constructing an entirely new alignment somewhere west of the airport? Is it a matter of impacting 4F resources through the extension of the existing grid system somewhere on the west side? Or is it a matter of widening another arterial in Missoula? And we know how difficult that can be. So that's generally, again, in very broad brush terms, what we're looking at with an environmental process, which again, you're probably a year or two away from even initiating. But those would be your first biggest hurdles. What's the need for the project? What alternatives are available to an alignment that would impact 4F resources? And then what opportunities do you have to avoid or minimize those 4F resources if you were to construct an alignment on the west side? So that's a very quick overview, and I'll go ahead and just open it up to questions from any of the council people if you have anything immediately.
I guess just to help out, do you know what all these properties are, Daryl? Can you help explain what some of these are? I mean, for example, on the top left, isn't that Kelly Island Park?
Exactly. The specific areas, Dwayne, I may need some help with, but you've got the state lands there shown in purple off to the western side. Is that
I believe that's Kelly Island.
okay, is that Kelly Island Park?
Yep.
I don't know the individual parks down on the bend down near Blue Mountain Road, but you've got some, it's part of Fort Missoula. There are public lands involved in that area. Off to the west, you've got the JTL gravel pit. That's been identified as a future park. That's probably an important point to make. Under the 4F regulations, if a parcel is even undeveloped, but it's slated for development as a park, you better treat it as a 4F protected resource. So even though it's not officially developed or under use as a park, during your initial planning efforts, you need to consider that as a protected resource because of the intent to develop that as a park in the future. You've got the Missoula County Big Sky Park. Actually, that's the big square blue area there, just above South Avenue, if we've got that identified correctly. You've got a large easement, the Tower Street Conservation Area, that's generally just south of the Clark Fork. The orange dots on the map are all schools. Schools are only considered 4F if there is a public recreational use. So just because it's a school doesn't necessarily make it a 4F resource, but if there's a playground or a soccer field or a track or anything like that that is open to public use, then that property, generally in its entirety, is considered a protected 4F resource. Those are your general constraints in that area.
Yeah, Daryl, I have a question. If we assume sometime in the next 10, 15, 20 years, the 35,000 people that are coming to Missoula now to work is going to grow somewhat with the 90 or so subdivisions that are on the boards now in Ravala County. So it seems to me we get down to how do we handle this traffic? That's really the central question. Now, does that get down to 8 lanes on reserve? Does that get to a western bypass? Does that get down to a go behind Patty Canyon up on the east side of Mount Sentinel? Does it get down to going up Blue Mountain? And maybe there's a couple other choices too, but that's at least 4 of them.
Sure.
So then we get down to all right, of all those choices, what's the most feasible, what really works? And that's kind of where we need to get this thing ginned down to, it seems to me, because I think there's little question that the growth in Ravala County is going to make this a Missoula County, Ravala County problem. And we really have to come down to some kind of a solution. Best, what do they call it, best available technology? We got to come down to the best solution out of maybe 4 or 5 bad ones. But somewhere in there has got to be some planning begun and deciding where it's going to be and setting about getting that underway. And it truly is a Missoula and a Missoula County, and I think a Ravala County problem that we've got to come to grips with, and we can't just, and for me personally, I'll be toes up. No problem with me worrying about a western bypass, but it's going to be a significant problem for this community. And I think, all we're trying to do now, and you're very helpful, okay, what are the problems? What are the hurdles we have to deal with here? So if you could kind of address those 4 alternatives, I would appreciate it. And if you've got a better one, trot it out.
I can assure you I don't have a better solution at this point, but you're absolutely correct that when you look at the aggressive growth in Missoula, and particularly, but throughout the Bitterroot, you're going to have major congestion issues, and in the future, you're going to be even more restricted on the potential for new alignments, bypass alignments. So if it's something that the community looks like, yeah, we think we want to do something eventually, this is the time to start planning it, preserving that corridor, but you've got to do that at the local level, in the county level, and start preserving that right away. As I said, this whole project development process is better than 10 years, and millions and millions of dollars to get it done. As far as looking at different particular alignments, we've certainly not done that. That's not what we've been tasked to do at this phase. This is purely intended to show you anything in this general area has major constraints. So as you think about it as a community, is that a path that you would want to go? What's the next step? And all I'm saying is it would take a major endeavor to look at various different alternatives to avoid these resources. So does that mean something off Blue Mountain, west of the airport? Maybe. Does it mean widening reserve to 8 lanes, 10 lanes, whatever it is? That would probably be an alternative you'd have to look at. During the transportation plan update process, there's certainly an opportunity to raise this issue, look at some different things through the running of the regional transportation model to see what a western bypass would do with traffic projections, increasing congestion on the local grid system. What happens if you build a bypass out to the west? What happens if you widen reserve? What happens if you run one up the middle here? That would be the next step, is to just plug something into the model and see what happens. And that's a planning tool. It's not an answer to tell you what to do and when to do it, but it's certainly your next best tool to start that discussion. Dwayne.
So Darrell, it seems like what you're saying is that all of those things would be part of the actual, when you showed us the process, that would be if we went into the feasibility study that we said would cost several $100,000. That's when all of that would happen.
Exactly.
So you also said that there's currently not a substantial need for the bypass. Is part of the reason of that is that anything we do out here is just going to move the congestion to a different spot? In other words, they're all trying to get to the same place, you just congested on Mullen Road instead of at Reserve and
Right.
93.
Let me just make sure I can clarify. I didn't say there's not a substantial need. I said there's not a substantiated need. There's not been an analysis so far that says
Okay.
you need to build a bypass on the west side, and that's based on the modeling efforts that have been conducted to date. When they plugged in just a general corridor in the model on the west side, it didn't show that it was pulling a lot of traffic out of downtown or off reserve in that model run. Again, that's been 6 or 8 years ago. With different growth rates and your current population and employment data, that could be a different story. So I can't really answer that. To date, the need for a western bypass has not been substantiated by the modeling efforts.
Somewhere in this map, and I don't see it, there is a veteran cemetery. Thank you. And I think you need to know that that probably won't be a road.
And that's a good point. This is really a pretty crude overview, and that's part of what I wanted this discussion to be about. Is I'm sure there are other resources in this area that deserve special consideration that would be protected by different acts under the Department of Transportation's policies, and certainly a historic cemetery would fall under
Well,
this
it
type of
hasn't
protection.
yet started filling up, but it is on what is state lands property
Right.
near the Big Sky Park, and I can't point it to you on here, but
Okay.
you need to put that down as something to look for.
Okay, thank you.
So it's actually that, if you see where Big Sky Park is, the big blue square,
Right.
the big white spot to the side there is DNRC, and it's that funny shaped little piece down towards the south.
Thank
Okay.
you.
I've got 8.5 by 11s of this map as well. Did everybody get a copy of the map, or does anybody want any in the back?
Daryl, two things for you. One is, would you explain that this is solely based on the assumption that federal funds will be used to build this roadway? Also, would you go in and explain basically legal sufficiency, and if you want, we have a couple of FHWA employees here as well. I don't mind putting them on the spot. Maybe they'd want to come up and explain legal sufficiency. You keep mentioning
Sure.
very challenging to get this through, and I think if you
What does it really
explain-
mean?
Yeah.
Okay. The first point is pretty critical. As Dwayne has indicated, this rule, this Section 4F protection, only applies to a project that involves federal funds. It's a federal act. It applies to the U.S. Department of Transportation. So it doesn't necessarily apply to the state. It certainly doesn't apply to the local level unless there are federal funds involved in the construction of the project. Actually, any phase of the project. So whether it's the environmental process or construction, if there are any federal funds involved, this protection applies. If it's purely a local county project, there's no protection for these Section 4F resources. So that's a very important distinction. And when we talk about whether there are feasible and prudent alternatives, you'll see that in the definitions in that handout. What does that mean? Who makes that decision on whether it's prudent to move it or whether it's an acceptable impact on that resource? There's two things that apply there. One, whoever has jurisdiction over that particular resource. If it's a park, your local parks board would weigh in on whether they think that's a significant, quote-unquote, significant impact to their resource. If it's cutting off part of a ball field, cutting off the third baseline of a ball field, they're going to say, you know what, that's a significant impact to our resource, and you can't do that unless you provide some extensive mitigation to rectify that issue. If it's cutting off part of a parking lot that serves the park, that's probably a little bit more mitigable in their minds, but ultimately the Federal Highway Administration will make the determination as to whether these 4F, or the impacts to a 4F resource, are acceptable or not. Dwayne mentioned legal sufficiency. What happens is during this environmental review process, the draft environmental impact statement would be sent to, I believe, the San Francisco Resource Center. It's about a 45-day review period for their staff to determine whether, based on case law and just their experience nationwide, on whether this is an acceptable impact under the federal law. So that's, I think 45 days is probably pretty optimistic. Is that fair, Craig?
It depends on, we usually turn around in 45 days. Really, legal sufficiency is just our legal staff to make sure we comply with the law and their legal opinions. So they do review all our 4F documents and make sure we're on sound legal footing. They generally ask a lot of questions.
We've got corridors actually here in Missoula. We've got a project down in Bozeman where we've got very narrow, constricted roadways with historic homes, and that just means they're better than 50 years old. They're nothing that anybody would want to tour, but they're protected resources under 4F, and we've got a substantiated need for, particularly on the project in Bozeman, for capacity improvements, turn lane improvements that impact these 4F resources. There's no feasible or prudent alternative, but we're being questioned pretty aggressively by the Federal Highway Administration on whether we can avoid or minimize these impacts. So it's not something that they will treat lightly, even when it's pretty apparent to everybody involved in the project development that, gosh, we have no alternative but to hit these resources. So it can be a very lengthy and extensive process.
And I want to make sure you guys have your questions addressed, and then I think we'll open it up for the public, so.
Does anybody recall how much it cost to widen Reserve to its current state?
You mean the north section of North Reserve from Third?
The whole, well, from Third, yeah,
Around 22 million,
22 million.
That was just from Third out to the freeway?
Third to the freeway. Now, that's not up down to the last penny, but that's close.
And that didn't involve, or did it involve right-of-way acquisition? Or did we use the existing easement?
I don't remember the answer to that.
Okay.
Dwayne, as we, since MCAT is recording this, as folks want to ask questions, we need to have them come to a microphone somewhere.
There's one here.
See the hands drops.
Yes, sir.
I guess I have would say as much to the crowd here as I would to you.
Sure.
But this is almost taking on the dimensions of an irresistible force meeting an immovable object. I don't see how we can not do something to deal with this. As somebody just mentioned, we've got 35,000 cars a day coming into Missoula. The realtors tell me we have 91 subdivisions coming online between Missoula and Hamilton. I live out in an area that's already looking at another couple thousand houses going in there and Miller Creek. Something has to give. And I look at this, all these constraints here, and I'm thinking something that has to change. If you did have a parkway come down through there, you might also provide access to some of these resources. If you cross the river in 2 or 3 places, that would be access to the river that doesn't exist now, so it might enhance some of those natural resource values. I think that has to be looked at. At this point in time, there's a bill in the House of Representatives that would direct the state DOT to take $500,000 appropriated in the bill and have the study, not with the idea of making a decision, but to put the alternatives on the table and go for some public meetings to find out what the public wants. Now, that may not go anywhere, but somewhere we've got to have various alternatives on the table with the pluses and minuses associated with it and start the public dialogue. We're looking at increased traffic coming in from Frenchtown and as far away as Superior. I'm hearing the other day from some of the people in the realtor business that even Drummond is starting to come online as a potential. The commute from Drummond's easier than it is from Hamilton, but we keep talking about this as a bypass. And in fact, I had one discussion with a state senator. Her point of view was she didn't want to see something where people would come up from Hamilton, get a cup of coffee and a tank of gas and go on through. And I explained to her, no, we're not talking about that. We're talking about people accessing Missoula for jobs, businesses, visits to the medical facilities we have in the state, the university system. These people aren't bypassing Missoula, they're trying to get into Missoula. So in my mind, something over on the west side becomes more a western access to Missoula than it does a bypass. If you come up through there and you cross the major roads in Missoula, they're east-west in several places, south, north, Broadway, et cetera, which means traffic could turn off and get into Missoula easier. I don't see as any way in God's green earth we're going to be able to sustain the traffic levels we have now on Brooks and Reserve and say that's going to last us for the next 20 years or 50 years or whatever it takes. Something has to give. And I guess that's why I'm pushing this very hard. Is we've got to have a public dialogue on where people will live with this. I'm sure there are people in the crowd today that are for it and some against it, and that's fitting. That's the way it should be. But I think we have to put the alternatives on the table. So I'm speaking to my comrade here alongside me that somewhere along this process, the state has to start some kind of a scoping study or whatever to determine where we go with this.
Okay. Councilman, let me just add something to that to make sure it's clear. The National Environmental Policy Act, that process doesn't dictate whether you can or can't build a roadway. It doesn't tell you where to build a roadway. It's about making informed decisions. That's all it does for you. So you're absolutely right. There's, we can identify needs in the community, whether it's a bypass or a new arterial or other capacity improvement projects. The sole intent here was to help identify some of the constraints that you do have on the west side, to maybe help focus your discussion, or to say, gosh, is this really what we need? So I think that's an important point. Dwayne?
Two things I want to clear up. Barbara kind of whispered a question to me, and I want to make sure that we're all clear on that as well. Craig and Daryl, correct me if I'm wrong here, but Barbara asked me if basically city funds or state funds could be used in those areas that would impact the 4F resource, and then use federal funds on the remainder of the roadway. My answer is no, because it would fall back into a cumulative impact, and therefore it would still be a violation of 4F and a NEPA.
It would. There's if you look at, I believe it's either in Kansas City or St. Louis, I can't remember now. There's is it in Kansas City or St. Louis, Craig? Overton Park.
Yes.
I think it's in Kansas City. There's a segment of interstate that starts heading off west of a beltway, and it ran into Overton Park, a parkland area, and it was a very similar situation where there was one entity constructing part of this roadway. When it came under federal review for the next piece, Federal Highways said, no, you have an impact on a 4F resource, and you can't go through there. You don't have the substantiated need to go through and impact this 4F resource. And that's been 20 some odd years ago. To this day, there's an interstate that stops at the edge of Overton Park, and these little local surface streets branch off of that and go around it. It is a very powerful piece of legislation, and the thing that hung that up was called segmentation. You can't build any piece of a roadway that might eventually impact a 4F resource, whether there's state or local funds involved in part of it. If any part of that roadway uses federal funds, no part of that project can use federal funds or impact the 4F resources. Councilman?
Then we may already be in violation of that because we already have roads starting, coming south from the north end of this proposed bypass or access, with subdivisions up there that are already in the city or want to be annexed into the city, and would certainly probably in the long run be a part of this system, or could be a part of this system. So I don't know where you stand on something like that.
Craig?
All right, you guys can make me move.
Absolutely. Sure.
Dwayne's gonna keep asking.
That's right. You might as well move in.
I had to get you up here somehow or another.
You might also tell Mike Sastead he can sit up front.
I guess as far as the question goes on those roads that are already built, I think much more of it's going to come to the intent. Certainly there's going to be surface streets that could be incorporated into a project, but I think the specific question Dwayne asked is, you're starting a project or building roads with the intent those will be incorporated into some future larger project to get around, whether it's a federal regulation or a federal policy that, certainly other surface streets that already exist, whether they're being built and they're being built within local processes. I don't think we'd look at that as segmentation because the intent wasn't there to circumvent the federal process.
How do you know that?
Well, that's a decision Federal Highways has to make. Certainly, a lot of it's going to, look back at the history of those roads, when they were built and what process they went through. I'm not going to be able to sit here and tell you, Dick, that that's never going to happen or will happen, but I guess, it's just something we'll have to look at as we go through any kind of a project development phase.
Some are being built as we talk.
Well, I understand that. There's always roads being built, but, I guess I haven't seen an issue like that where where you're talking about where other surface streets were built in conformance with local plans and local policy and went through subdivision laws and those kind of things, that we came in and said, no, you can't build this corridor because you already built these roads. I think the problem would be is once we initiate a project and start identifying alternative corridors, then if people went out and started approving projects, especially where there were things like a 4F resource or other environmental concerns, and punched through a cross-section that might fit in with that future bypass or whatever the project might be, would probably be, much more problematic once we started and initiated a federal project.
I think there's another concept under NEPA that it's called independent utility or logical termini. So if there's a project out there today or a piece that's already constructed that has independent utility, it serves its own function without connecting to anything else, I think that would clear that issue up for federal highways. So.
I guess, Darrell, if I can make one other clarification, I just want to make sure, maybe a question for you and a comment. I guess the first clarification on 4F is that although it is a hurdle, it's not an impossible hurdle. Like you were saying earlier, we have to show there's no other reasonable alternative other than to impact that 4F resource. So if there is no other alternative, you can impact the 4F resource, but you have to do that analysis. And I guess my question for you is maybe clarification on your map you held out.
Sure.
This is just large public land ownership properties. I assume you guys didn't do a research of any historic properties that are in here, whether it's homes or other features. I noticed, I don't think the golf course is on here and some of those type features, but you just did a large survey of land.
This is a very high-level survey of public land ownership, potential 4F resources. We pulled a lot of the information off the Natural Resource Information System. It's on the web. Anybody can go out and look at this information. The information they have on historic and cultural resources is so broad-brushed we can't really pinpoint anything. That would be based on that survey, there are historic and cultural resources throughout this entire area. So it would be highly likely that with either an environmental process or a feasibility analysis, anything like that, you'd have to do a detailed on-the-ground survey of this entire area.
One thing really quick, and I want to go back to Dick's comments because his comments are very correct. The one thing I want to point out is this is a challenge that's coming at all of us, not just MDT, not just the city, not just Missoula County. This is a train that's coming at us, and somehow or another we are going to have to deal with this. But the other thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to quit looking at MDT or the city or the county to resolve all these issues. We're going to have to come together as a community and figure out how to fix these issues. And by community, we have to bring in Ravalli County as well, because a lot of this growth is going on in Ravalli County, as well as even in Lake County, and it's all coming towards Missoula. We have got to come together as a community if we're going to figure this problem out and solve it.
Councilman?
I would second that very much. Not only Ravalli but Lake County and Mineral County and areas to the east of us. And I've hammered Craig at several public meetings over this. I think the Federal Highway Administration needs to take the lead in this, if nothing else. And people say, well, it would cost too much. I don't know what too much is, but it'll never get any cheaper, and it'll never have fewer people to use it. I don't see it in my own mind, something being built in one clatter anyway. It's something to be built over several years after you've gotten through all this process up here. But it has to happen. I don't think there's any alternative to it.
Okay. Councilman?
I'd just like to point out that, for me at least, it's in taking a look at future traffic challenges and so on, it's not a question of bypass or not a bypass. It may be that a bypass, quite to my surprise, would make sense, but who knows? But we also have to take a look at the single occupancy vehicles that we all use, and we have very few options not to use. We've got Mr. TMA, which I think needs growing and should grow by leaps and bounds. We've got an underutilized bus system in the area. Who knows? Passenger rail could well be a viable mode of getting to and from the Bitterroot as far as Darby and so on. So we need to take a really comprehensive look at this. I think our history of building roads and widening roads has only shown that more and more people fill them up. So we've got to take a look at all the options, it seems to me.
Dwayne, could I just clarify one thing that somebody just said about historic resources, that any house that's 50 years or older is also would have to be considered as you went through?
the 50-year threshold means that you'd have to at least analyze it for whether it's eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. There are 4 different criteria that'll be used to determine whether it's eligible for listing, which would give it protection. So at that 50-year threshold, it has to be assessed. It has to be analyzed. But it's not necessarily just because of its age eligible for protection, but it would have to be analyzed.
Okay, thanks.
My name is Helen Orndine, and I do have a question.
Sure.
And I think if I lived in target range, I would feel rather complacent, because it appears you're saying this Section 4F gives quite a bit of protection. As a matter of fact, in 2003, when the Blue Mountain target range people discovered that the Blue Mountain was the targeted for the interchange to link to Linda Vista, we did some research, and we studied the NEPA regs and came up with Section 4F, thought we had hit pay dirt, wrong. We used that argument to the federal highway, and it wasn't even addressed. It offered no protection. Blue Mountain is still on the books as far as a possible option. Furthermore, not very recently, the Missoula Country Club, which has a golf course, was also in jeopardy because the old 93 was being considered to be widened. And of course, that would cause at least 2 greens to be eliminated, and the country club would not be able to participate in tournaments. And in listening to you, it sounds like there's a lot of protection when you come up against Section 4F, and you avoid it. Well, I just want the audience to realize that that doesn't always happen, and I think that's something that we have to consider. Thank you.
We just clarify that Craig made this point, is it's not an immovable barrier. It is a hurdle. It is, if you can't show any other reasonable alternatives to those impacts, then there are allowable impacts under 4F. So it's not immovable. And again, the graphic that we're showing is not saying you have all these resources, there's no way you're ever going to build anything in this area. There are extra hurdles, extra analyses that would have to be conducted. So that's the point with the...
I think what we expected from your study was perhaps studying the issue and finding creative ways to deal with perhaps the historic and the recreational areas, because we've seen it in other cities where they haven't just had a corridor of commercial activity like Reserve Street, where it's done rather attractively, where you would have bicycle trails.
Before we go too far down this path, HCAM hasn't been hired to do anything other than this meeting. We haven't done any studies. We're not looking at alternatives. We were literally asked to come and help facilitate a discussion about what kind of resources might be out there to take a look at. There is no study. There is no project today. So just before anybody else gets up here and starts slamming us for not having done our homework, this is what we were hired to do. So thank you. Dwayne?
And I guess 2 things. One is Missoula Country Club would not classify as a 4F resource because it's actually a private entity.
Right.
And Craig, I guess I would ask you with FHWA, what 4F properties were impacted by the alternative that tied in with Blue Mountain Road?
Well, I kind of assume you guys probably didn't come to talk about Miller Creek today, but we can adjust some of that. Certainly the Galt Country Club we are looking into, but our initial analysis showed, since it was under private ownership, doesn't qualify under 4F. I think it's on there, Dick. The up Blue Mountain, the other thing for 4F, I don't know if you explained constructive use. I didn't necessarily hear that, but there's direct impact 4F property, actually putting the road on top of 4F land, which would be a direct use. And then there's constructive use, where you don't actually take the land, but your project has such a negative impact on a 4F resource it makes it unusable. I guess the up Blue Mountain itself, as part of our project, I don't believe we have any 4F properties we're converting directly to highway use. I know there has been some discussions with Helen and some of the people that live up Blue Mountain and Target Range as far as the secondary impacts of traffic and whether other additional widening have to be used up there. But those analyses are still underway.
Thanks, Craig.
Other comments? Can we ask you to use the mic? Thank you.
It appears that on your map, South Third is identified, which is actually South Seventh. Either that or the Hawthorne School is in the wrong place, but I believe the Hawthorne School is correct. So
Okay.
what is currently South Third on the map should actually read South Seventh, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
My name is Stuart Goldberg. I do understand that you're just here to present this today, and we're not here to discuss formal plans for a west side bypass. But in your inventory of 4F resources, it does show conservation easements. Am I to understand that that's all conservation easements, not just municipally held ones?
It would depend. It would have to be available for public use. It's not just because it's a conservation easement, it would have to be open for public use. That's kind of what Craig was going at. A private country club, even a public resource like a playground, if it's not open to public use, it's not protected by Section 4F. So just because it's a conservation easement doesn't necessarily mean it's protected by Section 4F.
The reason I ask is because my company owns the land just to the west of the JTL gravel pit. Northern Lights Development owns about 320 acres over there. We just preserved 257 of those with conservation easements. We are in active discussions with both the city and the county about public access, both to the summit of the butte and possibly including a pedestrian bridge across the Bitterroot River that would provide connectivity to the Blue Mountain lands as well, between the Blue Mountain lands and the JTL Fort Missoula complex. Understanding that this is potentially a 10-year process, I am sort of looking at my own 10-year process of trying to acquire public access for that. I am not going to do it if there is a possibility that Blue Mountain becomes the west side bypass. So I raise that so that your 4F maps are correct and so that the people at large understand that there are other forces at work here that are not necessarily yet reflected.
Good, and that's a good point.
Thank you.
That goes to, thank you very much. That goes to the adjacent JTL property as well. It's not developed currently as a park. If there are plans underway, such as this, that would be wise at this point to start considering that as a protected resource. So, just something to be aware of. Thank you. Other questions, comments? Sure.
My name is Ed Taylor. I live out in the Target Range area. I have a question, I guess, and some comments. When you said no alternative, or how did you phrase that on the?
There's no feasible or prudent alternative.
Does that include like an economic situation where it would be cheaper to run through the bypass? Let's say there was a west side bypass road that they've actually thought about, but if it was economically cheaper to build it there than perhaps do something else, would that
The
also
cost
fit in there,
difference
or?
has to reach an extraordinary magnitude. I'll ask Craig if he's got any specific guidance on that, but it has to be a pretty extraordinary difference in cost. So,
I should have stayed out in the crowd. No, I think you're right. You're not going to be able to get a number out of us, but you know, it is going to have to be some kind of extraordinary magnitude for us to not consider it a reasonable alternative. Normally, I tell people, you know, money isn't one of the decision makers in the NEPA process. It certainly is one that can come into play when you get to something that's so outrageously expensive. But at that point, we're saying it's not a reasonable alternative. So usually it's screened out early on because of that. But no, it would have to be a huge magnitude to show it to override the 4F law.
I'm no engineering expert for sure, but some of the rumors and hearsay I've heard crossing the riparian areas, building a couple, 3 bridges on a quote-unquote not proposed project was going to run up somewhere about $30 or $40 million. That seems to be a pretty high amount, I thought, but just as a word of thought, and this may not be the correct place to state this, but your statement about some kind of like a mitigation process, maybe not a bypass road, that to me kind of led me to believe that that whatever process might take place here is going to bring all this traffic in from the north, south, or whatever, and then we're not going to have any arterials to end up for them going onto. So I think we might be putting the cart before the horse here somewhat. The only other comment that I might have that maybe many of us haven't thought about would be there is another option to widening Reserve Street. I think a person could put another second deck up above the existing Reserve Street, make a dandy interchange by Walmart. We could be the first one to have a cloverleaf in Montana. So there you have it.
thank you.
Bob Giordano. I have a question. I'm glad Mr. Carey brought up transit as one option we could look to in the future of this region. The more I think about bus systems and trains, it seems like that could be a great way, especially as densities increase to the point that, excuse me, a lot of these transit systems become viable. That encourages that we don't think in terms of just light rail, which kind of means an overhead electrification, but there's a lot of new technologies that are a lot less expensive than the past. Diesel, multiple units, you could run them on biodiesel. I think we could have a great interconnected system. Would that be a possible way to look at an alternative, is say in transit and other modes, and not just where are we going to put another road?
The National Environmental Policy Act requires that you look at all feasible alternatives. Transit would certainly play a role in the development of your future transportation system. Your last transportation plan update had a pretty heavy emphasis on transit, bike and ped, and it relied on a pretty large mode shift from single occupant vehicles to multiple occupant vehicles, HOV, or high occupancy vehicles, or buses, or rail, or bike, ped, whatever it is. But
Whole systems.
You have to look at it in a holistic manner, and transit certainly plays a role in that.
With land use issues, and I mean, that gets to a big picture of zoning and everything, and that probably gets to law and how we can develop western Montana, but we might be at that point where we need these much bigger discussions.
Bob, the Federal Highway Administration issued a policy paper, within the last couple of years, and we've been talking about this concept for 20 years or better on the connectivity of land use and transportation decisions. And we've not done that very effectively, really anywhere. We've drawn growth boundaries and people leapfrog out, and then we've got sprawl development. But as you think about the incredible needs in this community, the current growth patterns, one of the councilmen pointed out earlier, this issue doesn't go away, and it's not going to get any easier to either build a new roadway or to shift people's mentality and their travel behaviors. It has to start today, no matter what your decision is. But that connectivity between land use and transportation is of utmost importance, and the only people that can affect that are you at the local level in determining what your densities are going to build out, if you're going to preserve corridors for future construction, or where you're going to spend your transportation dollars, whether that's on bike trails or transit or roadway improvements. And there has to be a mix in all of those.
Thanks.
Thanks, Bob. Okay. Any other questions? Alex?
My name's Alex Taft. I live at 439 Connell Avenue. I've spent my career looking at these issues, and I respectfully submit that you're having the wrong discussion here. You're having a discussion about what kind of road we should build. This, given the impact on the future of Missoula and Missoula County, you really have to take a broader view and look at what the future goals are for the city and county. And some of those other solutions that have to be weighed in as equally, if not more importantly, than the movement of people driving alone in their vehicle in the peak hour, and understand that is the problem that the traffic engineers are addressing, is 2 hours during the day when people are moving along a roadway. You have to weigh that with the impacts on the land use and our conservation lands in the area. So other solutions such as land use, which many of you elected officials have great say over, needs to be brought into this picture and weighed appropriately. More look at compact development, for instance. And as Commissioner Carey said, looking at other alternatives such as transit linked with good compact development can help solve this supposed problem in the future. And finally, a concept which is becoming more of a reality in the traffic engineering world is the effect of these kinds of roadways in inducing traffic and setting a course for the community that the community may not want merely by providing the physical capacity on the roadway so that people find an opportunity to drive their car and not use transit and move around the area uncongested. So I think we really need to change this conversation from what kind of road we should build to what kind of future do we want for Missoula and Missoula County. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex.
Hi, Sherry Kenyon. You had said currently there isn't substantiated need based on the modeling, but so that's kind of what is the reason why it isn't being pursued. However, folks are concerned about the traffic issue. I guess my first question is how do we reconcile those opposing opinions? And then secondly, how frequently is the model updated and how frequently are the numbers changed, percent growth rate, those kinds of things?
I mentioned earlier that the Metropolitan Planning Organization right now has a request for proposals out on the street. So they'll be hiring a consultant here in the next couple of months to update the transportation plan. The model will be revised at that point with new socioeconomic data. So again, it could very likely change with this model iteration, but I don't have any idea where that stands right now. But that's a process that will probably start. Mike, what's your best guess on a start date for the transportation plan update?
Probably about a month from now.
Okay.
How long will the process take? It's going to be completed by June of 2008.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I suppose the theory is that we'll reconcile these different opposing that the current model doesn't say we need a bypass, yet folks on the street feel like something needs to be done.
Yeah, I don't know if it's fair to say that it'll reconcile that. There will certainly be a discussion on that issue. Any other questions?
Hi, my name's Andy Sponseller. Well, one of my concerns about this is, well, amongst many, but one that I think is important to every individual in the room and children and future generations in this community is, do we have clean air? Clean air is probably the most important consideration in regards to single occupancy vehicle usage of roadways here in the Western Valleys, and that's not going to change. I suppose with global warming, we may have less snow, but I suspect that in the near future, at least in the next 30 or 40 years, that we will be inclined to expect summertime driving conditions in the winter here, which we've all become used to, and that's been achievable through sand and gravel and magnesium sulfate and other wonder chemicals that we drop on the road. I guess I'm trying to make a point. I'd like to ask a question as well. In regards to NEPA and the federal perspective on granting funds for projects, is air quality solely the purview of our local elected leaders and our local health board, or is that part of the process as well?
It's probably a two-part answer. The National Environmental Policy Act does cover air quality. You do have to consider air quality impacts. Missoula is in non-attainment for carbon monoxide and I believe PM10. That's particulate matter of a certain size, and it's basically due to the stuff that's put on the roads and gravels and combustibles that are in the air. With the transportation plan, because you're in non-compliance, you have to go through a federal review process on air quality. So any project that's proposed in that plan has to be in conformance with the air quality standards. If Mike wants to talk in any more detail on that, I'll invite him to do so. But so there's a two-level process. One, any project that's identified through the transportation plan update has to be in conformity with air quality standards. Then there's an additional review under the NEPA process through the environmental impact statement. So there's two shots at that apple. So
Yeah. One of the things that I'm amazed about continuously is the preoccupation we have with the number of alert days that we have here in Missoula, or lack thereof, but we don't talk about the number of days that are substantially dirty or close enough to be an alert day but don't even make the newspaper. I don't know that our newspaper here even reports very often about air pollution in that regards anymore. So I'd ask our elected leaders and folks on our health board to take a long, hard look at that. The other thing that I'd just like to comment briefly about is that transportation demand is one thing, accommodating single occupancy vehicles is another. And I think we should be clear about that. If we're really here about trying to figure out how we should accommodate single occupancy of vehicles and that kind of transportation freedom, then we should say so. And if in fact we want to meet transportation demand and have a prosperous, healthy community, then we should do that. And we should pursue actively, and I agree with a number of people, including Councilperson Haynes, that we should get to the business of figuring out how we're going to meet transportation demand. But I think that the assumptions that we're making in some of this talk is pretty assumption laden, and that we should really be honest about what it is we're talking about. I'm personally for a prosperous, healthy community that meets transportation demand.
Thank you. Any other questions? Phil?
Phil Smith. Dwayne, if I'd understood you right at the beginning of the meeting, you commented that the purpose of this activity or exercise today was to help determine whether or not it would make any sense to spend $300,000 or more on a full feasibility study about this project. And the question is, are we at this point today close enough to come to any kind of a conclusion about whether that sort of expenditure would make any sense or not?
And I guess, let me clarify. This process wasn't necessarily to give everybody a yes and no answer. I think what it was intended to do was to show the challenges, and by all means, I think Daryl's done an excellent job of showing just how extreme those challenges are going to be to a west side bypass. Again, that doesn't mean that it cannot happen. Even Craig's agreed that, you can still have 4F impacts, but it is extremely challenging. What basically needs to happen is we as a community need to get together, fund a feasibility study of some sort that looks into where are we going to go from here. And I think you've very clearly heard from the public in a lot of their comments that it shouldn't be focused on just widening Reserve Street. It shouldn't be focused on just building a bypass. I think there's a lot of issues that are going to be very challenging, very difficult, but we need to tackle them, and we need to start tackling them soon. But my point is, I don't think you can look at the county, I don't think you can look at the city, I don't think you can look at MDT or FHWA and say, you need to do it. I think we all need to do it together. We cannot sit here and rely on MDT or FHWA or the city or the county to foot the bill for it all. We're going to have to figure out a way to do it, because I'll tell you, from MDT standpoint, from FHWA standpoint, funds are extremely tight right now. They're very challenging. So the long and short answer to your question is no. I don't think I'm giving everybody, or I'm not looking to give everybody a yes or no answer out of this. I think everybody's got the idea that, yes, it's extremely challenging. I think it's helping us focus as to where we need to proceed in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Phil.
My name is Brian Walter. I live in Grant Creek, but where I live doesn't really have any bearing about what I'm going to say here. I'm in Mr. Nicholson's close to toes up category, so I don't really have I don't foresee any of this happening, rapid rail transit or bypasses or anything in my lifetime here. But I grew up in Montana, in a small town over in southwest Montana. And I take a look at the short period of time that has occurred since I grew up and now, and I see what is happening to this place of ours. And I believe that there's got to become a breaking point somewhere in this valley, in this area, where we reach a population level where we've really, in fact, destroyed this place. And that, of course, is the other alternative that needs to be looked at. When must we stop growth here to keep this place like we like it in Montana?
Thanks.
I'm Don Simmons, and I live in the University District. I mention that location because it's important in the things I have to say. I do hope that we keep our concentration on the fact that the problem is moving people rather than moving vehicles, and you don't need necessarily to pour lots of concrete to move people. There is an incredibly successful program at the university and throughout the city that accomplishes the former without the latter. 10 years ago, the university had probably 2,000 fewer students than they do now. At that point, if you didn't arrive on campus by 9 o'clock, you had no place to park. Now, 10 years later, with perhaps 2,000, and that figure I sort of draw out of the back of my mind, which is not always as reliable as it should be, but it's significantly larger. You can now, on Monday, Wednesday, or Friday at 11 o'clock, which is the highest population of students attending classes, you can find a parking place on campus. It might not be within 3 steps of the building in which you're going to have a class, but it's on the campus and you can reach it. This has resulted because of very cooperative efforts through Mountain Line, Mr. MRT, or whatever that's called, and the ASUM Transportation Office. It has been very successful in moving people. It has reduced by thousands the number of cars that drive through the University District in order for people to get to class. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm Patricia Hogan, and I live in the Franklin to the Fort neighborhood of Missoula. And I would just like to appeal for some kind of public education component to this discussion. I take the point that we really do need to talk about this intensively and come up with some new ideas, but I find myself being channeled into traditional ways of thinking about how to deal with transportation demand. So I would like to ask for maybe some public workshops on what's been done in other communities, or what are some of the cutting edge ideas to deal with, congestion and bypass issues. And, at the very least, maybe we could have some PowerPoint presentations online or something to help us understand what the issues are that we're discussing.
Thank you. Jennifer just whispering in my ear that, again, that kind of a process is critical during the development of a transportation plan update. And I'm sure Mike is jotting notes and has heard those suggestions before, that we do need more collaboration and need people to sit down and come up with a lot of creative ideas and things that have been tried in other communities and where they've had successes. So thank you. Sorry. Oh yeah, we've got some comment sheets here too. Mike asked that we have some comment sheets available. If anybody has written comments that you'd like to leave with the city, Mike Kress is over here in the plaid shirt on the side. Please leave your comments. If there's anything that you would like considered during the transportation plan update process, please jot your comments down and leave those for Mike. Thank you. I think there's an address on there. You can either leave those with Mike today, or I think there's an address on the comment sheet. You can just mail those in. Other comments, questions? How you doing, Nancy?
I'm Nancy Wilson with ASUM Transportation. I want to thank Don Simmons for pointing out that things are getting better at the university through transit, and also to point out how inexpensive that truly is compared to a project that we're thinking, this kind of a project that even could be brought to the table. We're struggling, the community's struggling at the moment with 3rd and Russell, and there's not enough money for that project for a long, long, long time. And for us to see the community putting forth $300,000 or more to do some kind of study when the projects that need to be done within the community are so great. We could use more transit. I take Mountain Line every day. Route 2 is jam-packed. I don't know who said that we have an underutilized transit system. I can tell you our transit system is cram-packed all day long. So maybe not every route. Maybe there's some routes that aren't as highly utilized, but there's some that are overutilized. So $300,000 could help that system a lot, and we could start moving people tomorrow. So I hate to see us, when the other point that came to my mind as we were talking about this is Missoula overwhelmingly just supported an open space bond, and they did that because Missoulians really want to have a beautiful valley to live in. And I don't think anyone can say that roadway is beautiful. It just isn't. And there's a train track that's empty and waiting for a nice train system. There's Mountain Line buses that we could throw some more buses on the road for $300,000 easily. You know, let's start doing something different instead of just moving in this direction that seems to have a failed outcome.
Thanks, Nancy.
Hello, I have a comment too.
Sure.
My name's John Langstaff. I live up Grant Creek Road along with Brian and Don in that neighborhood. And it affects us when Reserve Street dead ends. We have heavy semi-truck traffic turning around in my front yard. I rebuilt my fence innumerable times because semi-trucks can't turn around at Bench and Grant Creek. And I'm just impressed with all the friends and acquaintances and people of concern that have showed up here today to express interest and promote a bypass that would affect all the traffic coming up Highway 93 North that is unfortunately routed to the end of Grant Creek. It's not an easy solution, but I would encourage all of you to support a roundabout way of getting to Highway 93 North instead of ending up somewhere up at the end of Grant Creek Road. So more power to you, and thank you everybody for showing up.
Thanks for your comments. Councilman?
I guess I'd like to make a couple of minor points, and they may not be relevant, but I want to say, first of all, when I was on the city council here in 1968, the most difficult transportation problem we had in town was Malfunction Junction. So I moved back here in 2000, and I asked some of my good friends, what's the worst traffic problem you have here? And sure enough, it was Malfunction Junction. So I was kind of cavalier about it. I said, well, I'll tell you, if you can't solve your worst problem in 32 years, you don't have a problem. Now, the point of that is, what we're talking about here now is way, way, way more difficult than Malfunction Junction ever thought of being. We have multimodal, we have bus, we have transportation, we have bicycles, we have where are we going to put it? We, at the very least, we have how much is it going to cost and who's going to pay for it? I mean, there are some very, very difficult questions here that really need answers, and at least we need to begin grappling with what the answers might be. And the young lady who said that she would appreciate, Patricia Hogan, some public education and some workshops and some sort of getting to it. Brian and I might wish we could stop growth in Missoula, but we can't do that. Missoula is popular, people will move here, it's going to grow. What we can do is mold the growth, and what we can do is handle the transportation, and what we can do is develop the bus transportation, as Nancy Wilson has said. This is not a one-answer problem. This is a problem that's going to have many, many facets to it. It's going to take many, many years, and really the value of meetings like this is we're finally trying to talk about and begin working on a very, very difficult problem. And I applaud all of you for being here, for commenting, for putting your oar in the water and realizing, helping us realize that this isn't simple. It's far from simple. It's the most difficult one. Russell and Third is a $40 million project with 7 roundabouts envisioned on it, and it'll suck up every dime we have for 20 years. So it isn't a short-term problem either, and maybe it's not as important as Third and Russell. It isn't that we don't have plenty of problems around here to work on. It's just it's darn hard to figure out which is the most important problem, where should we spend our first dollar. That is really hard to figure out. So I applaud you for coming here. I appreciate knowing what 4F means and what the difficulties might be, and maybe it does indeed King's X the whole thing. And Brian and I will hold hands from one grave to the other, and you guys can have a good time.
Thank you, Councilman.
I kind of piggyback on those comments. Lost my train of thought here.
You're thinking about holding hands?
Missoula right now, and certainly will continue to grow in importance as the economic and cultural center of an area that I think goes from the Continental Divide almost to Coeur d'Alene, and certainly from Whitefish to Salmon, Idaho. We have 2 hospitals, we have all kinds of medical and pharmaceutical research going on, we have the university that's part of that. There just isn't anything else out there to compete with it. And I'm right where Councilman Nicholson is, it's going to continue to grow. And I think everybody has to understand that. What bothers me when we start talking about this, and I've heard some of that this afternoon, this is not meant as a critique of anybody's comments, no way. But I don't think we can look at this kind of a problem in terms of a transportation plan that has a 4-year span. I think we need to talk in terms of 50 years or longer. When you start building bridges, you build bridges for those kinds of time spans, and I think we have to look at the growth projections in 50 years. I hear somebody make comments about education and public forums. I would agree with that. That was the intent of trying to get the state, and eventually, hopefully, the state will follow through with some kind of a study. And I recognize $500,000 is a lot of money, and you could do other things with it. But nevertheless, somewhere we have to have those public meetings, and they are not free. And that's what that money would be used for, is some of that public education, some for getting the public comments, some for helping people to understand what kind of a time frame we need to be looking at. And so, again, I would say thanks for coming, and I appreciate the comments very much.
Thanks, Councilman.
My name is Chris Hopwood. I live on Blue Mountain, and the question I had goes back to the map. It sounds like Blue Mountain is one of the alternatives that is being, the feasibility is being looked at. But the map really kind of like stops short. Why? Is there more of this map that you guys actually looked at?
No, and let me reiterate again. We didn't look at the feasibility of any alignment. This was just a general, what's on the west side that presents some obstacles.
But your west end ends before really truly Blue Mountain. You've got one little jag that shows the road where the RD is, but it doesn't show any of the rest of it. So how can
Right.
people know what areas are potentially also for F resources?
We could certainly extend that map, and under future studies, I'm sure that as those alignments are developed, you would look at that in more detail.
Okay.
So that's, again, this is just a first blush, what kind of obstacles are out there. You could look further west, you could look at several different alignment alternatives to figure out what kind of obstacles you have, or if there's a better opportunity for an alignment somewhere. Again, that wasn't the intent of this particular meeting. We weren't looking at alignments, we weren't doing a feasibility analysis at this stage. It's a discussion on what kind of obstacles do you have, what process would you have to go through to get you that answer. So this, again, this isn't designed to be, you can't build this roadway here because of this. It's, in general, here's a discussion about the types of resources and hurdles that you would run into with the development of a bypass. So don't take this as, well, we've got our answer now. We can't build it from Blue Mountain north, or we can't build it through this area. That was not the intent today.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I guess, Daryl, maybe Dwayne, if I could ask a clarification. This is something that was confusing me a little bit as I came here today as far as the intent of what you were doing here. But if I understand this right, really, the intent of this study was, occasionally comes up, people asking about a west side bypass, and there's always these comments, well, we got this 4F or Fort Missoula or this out there. So you guys asked Daryl to just kind of take a look at what some of those resources were, so when those come up and somebody mentions, well, there's Fort Missoula, there's this or that, that MDT and the local governments understand at least what some of the land ownership issues are out there. And when you're talking about this additional study, whether it's 300 or 500, whatever the dollar amount, but I think what I hear you guys saying is you're looking at potentially funding not a study necessarily of just the bypass, but if I heard Dick right, more of a long-range transportation plan of we're identifying the problem as this increased traffic, and the bypass is maybe one potential solution or one portion of a solution to that, but that study would also look at transit options or increased arterial system or bike routes or whatever, a whole suite of scenarios maybe, or land use planning or reduction in VMT, whatever you come up with, but more of a long-range plan to try to come up with a solution to that problem versus a study of just the bypasses. Am I correct in that understanding, Dwayne?
Yeah, as well as, you know, Dick's right. I mean, it is going to be a more larger encompassing feasibility. And the more that we can do things like this to hone that, you know, and save money up front, the better off we are. And that was the main intent here, is to get the focus off of, okay, let's look at this corridor on the west side for a bypass. I don't think that's the direction we want to go. The direction we want to go is exactly what Dick's talking about, a greater area, and see what all options are available to us.
Okay, and thanks for that clarification. I just want to make sure I didn't misunderstand you too, Dick. You said you wanted federal highways to do that for you. I hope I misunderstood you.
No, you didn't. I'm not sure where such responsibility would rest. Right now, if this bill goes through the House, it would rest with the State Department of Transportation. And I would say whoever has it's going to be done by perhaps a consultant sitting here today, but somebody to do that. And I'm not laughing at any alternative. You know, the gentleman suggested stacking two lanes, one over the other. That might be very feasible in the long run. I don't have any idea how those kinds of things would shake out. Rail obviously has to be looked at. I have been in these discussions in several local meetings, and people bring that up, and I think that has to be on the board. What's it cost? What are the problems that would have to overcome to become reality? I think those kind of things, and recognizing that nobody's going to have definitive answers to any of these questions, but they've got to have some comparative answers so the public can say, I'm for this or I'm not for that kind of thing.
And there's certainly lots of potential solutions. I guess the one thing with federal highways, certainly eligible for funding something like that, but certainly we'd be looking to the MPO and the local governments to lead any kind of an effort like that. I think the local community has to do their planning and identify the vision for their community. I don't think you want federal highways coming in and doing that for you.
One of the reasons I was talking federal highways is you're involved in this bridge proposal out of Lower Miller Creek. And certainly that would or could be part of a solution also, or a potential solution should be looked at it. And that's your baby. So you'd want to look at that aspect of it.
There's a lot of potential pieces to the puzzle that might
yes, you bet.
fit together.
And I would ask that, and I realize you weren't supposed to do that at this point, but when you're identifying the area that you've shown, I would ask you to also map the floodplain, because if you find a likely looking spot and it doesn't have the floodplain, and the floodplain's 2 miles wide, a bridge 2 miles long, it's going to cost a lot of money.
Pretty expensive.
And so I think we need to have the floodplain identified as well.
We do have a number of different resources on a lot of maps. We've got several layers. We wanted to focus on the 4F resources today, but you're absolutely right. There are threatened and endangered species issues with the bull trout. There's floodplains, there's wetlands, you've got air quality, you've got noise issues. There's a lot of stuff that's not on this graphic today, just because we're trying to stay a little bit focused on some of the major hurdles.
Is it safe to assume that if you showed all that, it would make the picture even grimmer?
It makes it makes the alignment more difficult to try to trace through there, absolutely. And as you start looking at all these different impacts and Superfund sites and leaking underground storage tanks, none of those are immovable, but the price tag keeps growing. So when you run into all that stuff, it just costs more money. And we've really not touched on the project funding block that I put up there, but that is a very critical piece of this as you start thinking long term. And a couple of the councilmen have raised this issue. When you think about through the transportation plan update process and a future feasibility analysis or alternatives analysis, that's the time to start prioritizing your projects. And if this turns out to be something that the community says, this is our number one priority, then that's how you stack that up in your transportation plan update and say, this is project one. And, the councilman talked about Russell South Third sucking up a lot of money over the next 20 years. This would be a major hundreds of millions of dollars project. So it's a major commitment for the community if it's something that you were to put forward.
I think the biggest thing I hope everybody takes away from here today is what Mr. Simmons said, that we need to think about moving people. Are there other ways that we can get ourselves from point A to point B besides jumping in the car all by ourselves? And so I hope that people get involved in the transportation plan update. We'll have over a year to go through that process. It's a good time to educate ourselves and look at alternative ways and what other places have done. One of the things that wasn't brought up today, but I think we need to think about too, is accessibility. Needs to be accessible to all people of all mobility needs. So we all need to get involved.
Any other questions?
I'm not seeing too many, I guess. Oh, go ahead.
Excuse me, I just wanted to make sure that in light of the, Ann Rupp Calvis, in light of the fact that there's such a high level of interest, I would encourage Mr. Kress to make public any possibilities for further public comment on the transportation plan.
My name's Amber Blake, and I'm the communications person for the Office of Planning and Grants Transportation Division. And I send out monthly, bi-monthly newsletter type emails that have information on any public meetings, updates of what happens at those meetings. If there's going to be, let's say the Scott Street overpass is having reconstruction on it, has information on that. And pretty much anything that will be going on with the long-range transportation plan update will be included in those. So if you signed up on the sign-in sheet today, I was going to collect your email addresses from Jennifer. If you don't have an email address and you would like to get it by snail mail, USPS, or have some other way, you can note that on there and I'll make sure that you get the information. Thank you.
Thanks, Amber.
Thank you.
That's very helpful. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for this little email I got. If no one's got time to read the city and county websites, we'll need to come up.
Just to make sure, did that sign-in sheet make its way all the way around the room? Okay. If you did not get a chance to sign that, please catch it on the way out. We'll leave it out here on the counter on the way out the door. With a pen.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Say again?